For the first minute, let me take you straight into the moment when everything changed for me. I had been wrestling with compost bins for years, turning them, managing their moisture, fighting off odours, and waiting endlessly for a batch to finish. It felt like I was doing all the work while the compost barely kept up. Then I stumbled on a method so old, so natural, and so efficient that I realized I had been overcomplicating everything. Worms, not in a bin, not in a fancy tower. Just worms working directly in the soil in a way that produces more castings, faster, with almost no maintenance. The first season I switched, my plants responded like I had never seen before. What I learned is that when you stop trying to control decomposition and start working with the natural behaviour of worms, you create a system that feeds your garden every single day instead of in batches. Whether you've been composting for years or you're just starting out, what follows is a method that drastically simplifies your routine while improving the quality of your soil. And for Botanical Bliss viewers who love practical, grounded garden wisdom, this is one of the easiest and most rewarding changes you can make. The shift happens when you realize worms work best in the ground, not in bins. The first insight comes from understanding worm behavior. Compost bins force worms into an environment they tolerate rather than prefer. In the soil, worms have natural temperature regulation, freedom to move, consistent moisture, and access to microbial partners. When I stopped confining them to bins and instead created feeding zones directly in my garden beds, everything became easier, you know. The worms multiplied faster because the soil environment supported them naturally. Their castings stayed right where the plants needed them. And I no longer had to harvest, sort, sift, or move heavy piles of compost. A practical example is simple, really. Choose a corner of your garden bed, dig a shallow trench, and fill it with kitchen scraps. Cover it with soil and let worms migrate to it. As one area finishes, move to another. Before long, your entire bed becomes a mosaic of micro-feeding stations, each pumping out worm castings without a bin, a tray, or a lid. The core technique is called trench feeding, and it outperforms bins because it mirrors how decomposition works in nature. I began by creating narrow trenches about 8 inches deep in the paths between beds. Into these trenches went vegetable scraps, shredded leaves, spent plants, and even torn paper. After covering the trench with soil, worms began tunnelling in from the surrounding earth. Over time, they turned these trenches into nutrient highways, delivering worm castings into the root zones of nearby plants. A gardener can implement this by rotating trenches throughout the year. Start at one end of the bed and move systematically. The soil becomes richer, darker and more crumbly because the worms carry castings in every direction. The result is not a compost pile, but a compost network, a living infrastructure beneath your garden that, well, renews itself constantly. One of the biggest surprises was how fast the worm population increased once I stopped confining them, you know. In bins, worms often struggle with temperature swings, limited space, overcrowding and stagnant air. but in the soil they regulate themselves. They migrate if an area becomes too warm or too wet, and they expand into fresh zones as food sources shift. They reproduce quickly because the soil offers everything they need: carbon, moisture, microbes, and safety. If you want to encourage faster growth, you might try adding shredded paper, straw, or partially decomposed leaves along with your kitchen scraps. These materials provide structure and carbon that support microbial activity. As microbes proliferate, worms follow them, breaking down the materials further and depositing some of the richest fertilizer nature can produce. This balanced environment is what allows the population to maintain itself without intervention. Traditional composting requires months of waiting before you can use the finished product. Worm castings produced in the soil are available almost instantly. As worms work through a fresh feeding trench, the castings they produce integrate into the surrounding earth within just a few days. Roots take up nutrients directly from these zones, resulting in stronger, greener growth without the need for hauling compost around or buying fertilizers. A good example is using this method in a tomato bed. You simply dig a trench between rows and feed it weekly with scraps. Worms will process the organic matter continuously, and the tomatoes benefit from a steady nutrient supply. Gardeners who try this often see thicker stems, earlier fruiting, and improved drought resistance because the soil structure improves with every pass of the worms. You know, the greatest advantage of ditching bins is really the elimination of labour. There's no turning, no managing piles, no worrying about ratios, and, well, no lifting. The soil just handles temperature, moisture, and airflow naturally. During winter, worms retreat deeper into the soil, and the microbial action slows, but you see, it doesn't stop. When spring arrives, the system wakes back up without any reset or rebuilding. You can maintain the system by feeding trenches once every week or two, just adjusting based on how quickly the materials disappear. If you see that the soil surface is sinking, well, that's actually a good sign. It means the worms have broken down the material and pulled it into the deeper layers. Simply add more scraps and keep moving along the bed. The real magic of this bin-free worm casting method is that it creates a garden that, well, pretty much feeds itself. Worms work continuously, plants receive steady nourishment, and the soil grows richer each season. The method requires almost no equipment, works in any climate, and, honestly, it scales from small beds to large gardens. It is a return to natural systems rather than a reliance on artificial containers. If you want more grounded, practical, time-tested gardening wisdom, subscribe to Botanical Bliss and, share this video with someone who wants healthier plants without the hassle of compost bins. Your soil and your worms will reward you every season.